All right. Good. Hello. Okay, you can hear me? Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm William Seelig, and I work in Science Information Services here at Menlo Park. I'm glad to see everyone attending for our November public lecture. Before introducing tonight's speaker, just as a reminder, we will not be having a December lecture, but please, join us for our January 26th lecture. It'll be on tsunami modeling, and you can pick up a flyer on the back table there. So again, hope to see you all on January 26th for that lecture, and have a wonderful holiday month. But back to tonight's lecture. The lecture title will be presented by Keith Miles, and the title is Ecological Stressors. It's a lot of work. There is no place like California. Now, Keith Miles is the Center Director for the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. His career began at 16 years old as a clerk with the Johnson administration that continued with his bachelor's degree from Howard University. He holds a master's and a PhD in wildlife biology from Oregon State University, which he received in 1986, and then went to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a research biologist with the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. He joined USGS in 1996 and afterwards accepted a concurrent position as an adjunct faculty member at the University of California, Davis location. He is known for his research on ecotoxicological studies in aquatic and marine environments that includes the Salton Sea, the San Francisco Bay Area, the Aleutian Islands, and Prince William Sound in Alaska. Most recently, he and his colleague, Dr. Liz Bowen, have investigated gene transcription markers that are indicative of stressors such as contaminants, disease, and climate change in multiple species. He has authored or co-authored over 60 scientific publications and continues to enjoy writing. So, the USGS Monthly Public Lecture Series is pleased to bring you this program about ecological stressors. So, we'll take questions at the end of the lecture, and please welcome Keith Miles.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present, and thank you for taking time out of a probably relaxing cold evening, probably warm at home, to come out and hear about about WERC. And WERC is an acronym for the Western Ecological Research Center. The USGS Western Ecological Research Center is a geographically dispersed science community, and we're co-located with Department of Interior agencies, academic institutions, or in proximity to critical ecosystems. The center's mission is to conduct peer-reviewed research that provides natural resource managers with the knowledge to address challenges to ecosystem function and services in Pacific West landscapes. There's a couple key words in here. A lot of our work that we do at the Western Ecological Research Center is in relation to natural resource or land managers, helping them to understand the resources that they have and how to better manage or conserve those. So that is a major function of WERC. And I may be referring to the acronym of DOI, which is Department of Interior, which is our main group that we provide this service to. The Western Ecological Research Center is one of a national network of 16 research centers under the ecosystems mission area of the U.S. Geological Survey. There's also 50 research units co-located with academic institutions in almost all of the 50 states in the country. At our center, we have 23 PIs, or principal investigators, our lead scientists, and an equal number of support biologists that work with them, and then technicians, students, and administrative staff. So we total about 200 employees. We have 12 field stations, as you see, located throughout the state of California, with one field station just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. Our studies are conducted across the western U.S., and in addition, out into the Pacific and up into the Aleutian and Alaska landscapes. We do a lot of work with not only Department of Interior, but also We work quite extensively with the state of California and with other land resource or resource managers such as the U.S. military, one of our biggest clients in the state, and one of the most important when it comes to proper conservation of species. The U.S. military happens to be a very good steward for their lands and spend quite a deal of effort and funding to help protect species on their lands. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. So there are four primary science themes that guide our research at the Western Ecological Research Center. These science themes pretty much follow the science themes of the mission of the USGS ecosystems mission area. The first of these is the ecosystem response to human activity. This involves investigations of effects of renewable energy development, water abatement, fire and mitigation, invasive species urbanization, and barriers to survival and movement of species of concern. The second is stressors to species recovery. The Department of Interior has a responsibility to protect and restore environments and imperiled species. We conduct studies that assess key stresses that can limit a species' recovery and provide management options for restoration. The third, is that our third? Or is that, yeah. The third science theme is ecosystem processes and long-term trends. And this is investigation of fundamental processes of species of concern in the response of these processes to natural or human-related stresses such as fire and climate change. And the picture depicts browning of a sequoia, which is unprecedented in our knowledge of the life history of sequoias, at least for the past 100 years of recorded investigations on sequoias. And I will provide some example of that later in my talk. And the last of our science themes is applications for management use. And this is translating all of this data that we collect into predictive models or scenarios, interactive maps, climate change impact forecasts, hazard risks, and so on, that give resource managers and the public clarity on how to better understand what types of information we're bringing to bear. So the second part of my objective tonight is to provide you with an insight, a snapshot into some of the studies that these 23 PIs conduct. And that was an extremely difficult project for me because I feel that our 23 PIs are all very high-performing individuals that are doing such very applicable science that it was just a really difficult process for me to try to figure out what should I talk to you about. And so I decided to start with something that may be more familiar to this audience, and that is with the sea otter. The first story that I'd like to tell is one by Dr. Tim Tinker, and I've known Tim for 25 years, and I work with him in the field as a research scientist up in the Aleutians and in the Alaska environment. When he did this talk, we talked about it, and he wanted to say, instead of revisit it, how we got it wrong for the past 30 years. And the interesting thing is, he came after Jim Estes, whom a lot are familiar with all his 40 years of work on the sea otter, and he was a student of Jim Estes. And when I met with Jim a couple of years ago, he said, you know what, Tim figured it out. And so I'll tell you the story of this. The context is that sea otter populations were decimated in the late 1800s, early 1900s by the North Pacific fur trade, largely the Russian fur traders that came over and wiped out the populations that occurred naturally along the eastern Russian coast, throughout the Aleutian Islands and down the west coast of North America, all the way into Mexico. The California sea otter was thought to be extinct, but a remnant population managed to survive off of Bixby Creek just south of Carmel. And it's that population that has survived, that produced animals to this day. So we have about 2,500 or 3,000 animals surviving in California. It's very different from the tens of thousands that have recovered in Alaska. And so that was what we were trying to figure out. What's going on in California that's different from Alaska? Why such low population growth in Alaska? If you look at recolonization recovery in Alaska and in British Columbia, it was almost 20% per year over the 40 years of recovery. In California, that number is only about 5% per year. So we spent a lot of decades looking at all different kinds of factors that may be limiting sea otter recovery in California, including disease, pollution, and fishing bycatch. Because of the thought that sea otters were being decimated by gill nets, the California public decided that it was best to eliminate gill netting from a style or a type of fishing in California. But that, even done at least 15 or 20 years ago, still did not really help with the recovery of the sea otter. And if you look at how fast and how well the sea otter population in Southeast Alaska, for example, grew as compared to the California population, you can see it's quite drastic difference. However, after 2 decades of intensive study, we found no consistent differences in health or body condition of these animals. A lot of work done by Dr. Michael Murray out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium with us has determined that health-wise, these animals are just as healthy as the ones in Alaska. We couldn't find any consistent differences in age-specific survival or reproductive rates. Animals in California were having the same number of young, and the survival rates and mortality rates were about the same as those in Alaska. And we saw no consistent difference in population growth as these animals moved into new areas. That meant that if you got animals that moved in places in California, their rate would go up to about 18%. The same thing was happening in Alaska. So we were really perplexed, and finally Tim Tinker figured it out. It was a simple matter of habitat. If you look at the California coastline, it's pretty linear. It follows this model of just up and down. There's no going in. If you look at Southeast Alaska, south of Juneau, if you look at this coastline, if you laid all of this coast out, it would just extend 2/3 of California. So what was happening is that these animals had a lot more habitat to colonize or move into Alaska, and so it's been a simple issue of availability of habitat. And in essence, carrying capacity is very limited in California. And so with interpreting this out to what this really means is that the California population probably has never really been more than 10 or 15,000 animals. It probably will not get up to 10 or 15,000 animals because of urbanization of the coastline and other buildup of the coastline. So that we are going to be always experiencing a fairly low population numbers in California. This is brand new work. It hasn't been published yet, so but we feel very confident that we've figured out what's happening with the California sea otter. There is another little caveat or footnote on this, is that there have been increase in great white shark attacks on sea otters in California. So that's been having a little bit of an effect on the population numbers, but not great. But it is an interesting phenomenon that's just started happening in the past 10 years or so. The next research that I would like to highlight tonight would be that of Dr. Karen Thorne. She's one of our newest research biologists who came to us as a support biologist and really fit in so well with the type of work that she has expertise in, and that is the effects of sea level rise. And so we're moving from the coast with sea otters now into your backyard, into the San Francisco Bay Area. Karen has study sites at 18 estuaries along the California coast from Washington down to Southern California. These have very good application to resource managers. 10 of these sites are at National Wildlife Refuges, 4 are at NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserves, 2 are at Navy properties, U.S. Navy properties, 2 are at state parks, 2 are tribal areas, and 1 with the Nature Conservancy. So a very diverse group of land managers who are interested in what's going to happen to my property if sea level rise becomes a factor. What's going to happen to the tidal marshes in our area? Karen has collaborated with a number of academic institutions from Washington all the way down to Southern California to establish a collaborative data collection system relevant to the scale that's important for decisions. That is, what kind of scale do you need to measure in order to understand how vegetation will survive in these systems and how species of concern, such as the clapper rail or the salt marsh harvest mouse, which only occurs here in San Francisco Bay, will survive in the long term. Her studies are comparable across all of these 18 estuaries. It covers over 1,700 hectares and on about the intensity of study that's being done. Work is being done on looking at how well sediment accretes in these habitats, whether there is good sediment buildup. They're looking at the species that are using this habitat, water levels, marsh elevation, bathymetry, and vegetation. The marsh elevation is probably one of the most important factors that Karen is exploring. And so she's taking measurements, and this is the Petaluma Marsh north of here, and measurements are taken at each one of these dots of elevation. This information is fed into models based on what we know is going on with increasing sea level rise now, just with very contemporary information, and then modeling that with predicted models for what sea level rise will be like in the next 50 to 100 years. And what she is forecasting is that right now there's a mix of high and mid elevation vegetation, pickleweed in this Petaluma habitat. By 2070, there's going to be still some high level habitat that may be still pickleweed, we don't know, but a lot of the lower level habitat will become mudflat or inundated, and then by 2100, essentially 100 years from now, this habitat will be all mudflat. So this is just looking at this one section of a wetland, we're determining that in 100 years we're going to lose all the vegetation and associated species with that habitat. So they'll be very different in the future. What you see now with the current, with a mix of many species and vegetation, will transcend into higher level vegetation such as cattails or species that only can survive at higher intertidal levels, and reduction in species that are associated with it to either mudflats or, in this case, looking at Newport Bay, California, half of that wetland that looks like this now with different levels of high, mid, and low intertidal zones will convert to low or, in the red, subtidal zones. So you're losing critical habitat. What she is doing is working with the resource manager to determine, well, if we lose all this current habitat, looking at the areas that you are investigating, what's our potential for making up for it? If you look at this current habitat in Ballina, eventually this is going to look like that other scene with mudflat, and the only place that we can move into is this little strip right here. The same for Petaluma. We have this now. This is what we may have to work with in the future, and so forth across this map. That you see this kind of bright green is indicating that's all we can look for once sea level rise becomes a factor. So, in essence, there's limited space for upland marsh migration, primarily because we have steep slopes, or a lot of the wetlands are abutted by urbanization or roads, such as San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge in North San Francisco Bay. And there's just no real one-to-one replacement that we can expect on just letting things happen the way they will. There are some management strategies that might be able to be affected or put in play to help deal with this. But it's going to be a difficult process to work with land managers to either have to try to purchase new land or to grade land to prepare for the potential loss of these very diverse tidal wetlands out into the future. And this, for example, shows that the U.S. Navy down the Seal Beach is now actively spraying sediment onto areas in order to try to mitigate against the loss of wetland habitats, because this wetland habitats provides them with a nice barrier that protects their military assets on that base. So Karen has been working with all of the refuge managers, having periodic meetings with them, coming up with strategies for how they can work out 100 years into the future to prepare for this. So we move from the coastline in San Francisco Bay now into the Central Valley, which a lot of you may be familiar with. And this is the work of Dr. Joe Fleskus. Karen is one of our new PIs. Joe is retiring in a couple months, and I'm sad to see him go because we were fellow students at Oregon State University. He went from being a classical wildlife biologist to a really fine, oh gosh, what can I call him? Just he has such vision for where the future lies for water birds, particularly in the Central Valley, and what the recommendations for trying to make sure that we have the proper habitat for water birds in the Central Valley. And he basically now has gone into modeling all of the different issues that may face loss of water bird habitat in the Central Valley. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But the Central Valley is one of the most important waterfowl regions in the world. There's more than 10 million birds that winter there annually, and more than 25 species of those of the waterfowl, and then another 60 or so species of shorebirds or other types of wading birds that also utilize the Central Valley. But it's also, the Central Valley is one of the most plumbed in the world in terms of all of the different, given this diagram on the left, it shows all the different water bodies from the northern end of the Sacramento Valley down to the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. There, in the right diagram, shows all of the different government agencies that are involved in this, and also water districts, fed, state government, and other private concerns that are plumbing this water and have rights to this water. So this becomes extremely of concern to biologists, because if you look at, based on the Department of Water Resources data, this is how the water is divided up in the Central Valley. You have 10% going to cities, 41% going to farms, 47% for flows that also benefits fish, but maintaining good flows in this maintains a healthy ecosystem. And only about 2% going to water birds and waterfowl. So Joe has worked with the state of California, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ducks Unlimited, and other organizations to develop what's called the WEEP model. And this model is looking at what the future supplies of water are and what the future demands are on that water. And given that those demands and the supply, how is that going to affect water birds? Because basically, if you take away this 2% of water for these 25 million birds or more that are wintering in Sacramento Valley, it can have a detrimental effect on their survival. So I don't want to get too much into how this model is all divided up, but it also takes into account several climate models, from a fairly severe model of the GFDLA2 model, which predicts a very hot and dry climate out into the future. The PCM1 is less severe, and then a model just using what's going on right now, which is also showing some signs of potential climate issues. Urbanization projects in the Central Valley could go from expansive growth to strategic growth, which would be preferable, to no growth, which is probably unlikely as we got a growing population. And then water management proposals, especially those that involve intertransfer of waters around the state, issues like idling agricultural lands, that when you don't have enough water and the current situations, and then others. So there's lots of different scenarios that fit into this model. And I don't want to go into all of the details of this because I'll put you all to sleep. But what I do want to show you is Joe has now modeled this for 7 of 9 important waterfowl basins in the Central Valley, and he's just about completed Yellow and is working on the Delta section right now. And I'll concentrate my discussion of results on the Butte Basin up in Butte County in the northern part of the Central Valley. So don't panic too much about what this displays, but basically the blue line shows what the condition of waterfowl or waterbird habitat is without any stress on the system, and they keep their 2% of water. The dips in this are predictive drought periods. This red line is the most interesting one because that's a mild climate, but or mild climate change prediction, but expansive growth. And what you're seeing here is probably pretty much the same as if we look at more severe climate conditions out into the future with the severe drought points indicated, that there is a lot of overlap of either expansive urbanization and or more severe climate going out in the future. And what this is saying is that we will lose anywhere from 1 to about 15% of the available waterfowl or waterbird habitat in the Central Valley based on this scenario. But here's the worst case scenarios that have shown up. Again, this is on a different scale, but here are the lines I showed just on the previous map. Now we're putting in moving water from the Central Valley, northern end of the Central Valley, down to other parts of California. And also, in doing so, the only way you can really do this effectively is that you're going to have to put certain types of agricultural land into idle. And that means rice farming. And rice farming provides quite a lot of very important waterbird and waterfowl habitat in the Central Valley. This is the loss of habitat across Sacramento Valley if this was to occur. This blue line shows a 76% loss of waterfowl habitat in Butte County using this type of scenario. So what we're able to show the municipalities, federal, state government, landowners is that there is a critical need to make very good decisions before you start moving water and using idling rice farming as one solution for being able to have water to move. It'll have a detrimental impact on water birds as we move out into the future, and this pushes out to about 50 years out into the future. So this is again showing you some very important work that's being done by Joe Fleskes and his team, and that this will be very usable models, very interactive models that the land managers and resource managers can use to help preserve or conserve water birds out into the future. The next place we'll go up into is into the Sierras, and this is the work of Nate Stevenson, Dr. Nate Stevenson, and Dr. Phil Van Mankdom. Nate is located in this Sequoia Kings National Park, co-located at Sequoia Kings. Phil is co-located in the Redwood National Park up north. They have been looking, Nate in particular, has been looking at the demography and natural history of big trees for 30 years. And what he is because we have such long-term, again, that theme of long-term data set, we're now able to pinpoint changes that are occurring in, say, the sequoia forest that are unprecedented, never been recorded in history in California, is seeing the type of effects that the drought is having on the sequoias. Their research is key in revealing the trends across the western United States and the effects of drought and drought-related wildfires on the current forest structure. Their research has shown long-term chronic increases in background tree mortality that has not been seen in the history of looking at these forests. And that means that it's probably increasing temperature that is causing this. So they have now teamed with the Forest Service, Park Service, and academic institutions such as Berkeley and Stanford and the Carnegie Institution to look at what exactly does this drought mean to the populations of trees and whether there are management actions that might be instituted that may help offset if this drought does continue. So this has three major components: remote sensing from the Carnegie Observatory, actual on-the-ground population monitoring, and looking at leaf chemistry and physiology. And remote sensing from the airborne platform is the most important because it allows them to cover large swaths of the western United States, in this case the Sierra Nevadas, and looking at what effects is drought having on tree populations of different species within these environments. There's calibration and validation by ground truthing the information that the airplane is picking up in the remote sensing. To essentially, they're looking at tens of thousands of trees that are being assessed for health and causes of death. Also, they're looking at in 10 dominant species of trees that have been precisely marked and identified in the forest. They're looking at issues of water content, water stress, nitrogen, non-structural carbohydrates, and other issues that can tell them exactly what types of stress is killing these trees and how long that stress may occur. So the early results for the giant sequoias suggest that the differences seem to be driven by whole tree leaf area. That is, the most drought-stressed sequoias that you see here in orange are shedding their leaves in relation to the drought. But what we still have to determine, what does that mean to 1,000 and 2,000-year-old trees? And if we do still continue to see evidence of continuing stress from drought, then they will start looking at issues of why are some trees, for example, in this diagram, if you look, there's these orange trees which are stressed, interspersed with green trees that are doing pretty well, and blue trees which are doing very well. Well, it could be topography, elevation, there could be a number of factors, but there may be some ways of at least looking at this area and determining management actions that may help protect these, because if climate change in that worst case scenario occurs, then this area up here is going to look like this area down here as the temperatures creep up slope. I think this is the third or last, I'm not sure. The next study I'd like to talk about is looking at genetic diversity, genetic variation as an indicator of the health of wildlife populations. And in particular, this work is being done in Southern California, where there is a fragmentation of habitat mainly due to roads and urbanization that prevents good dispersal of species that provides for good genetic diversity. Having good genetic diversity means that when changes occur, like climate change, you have a better chance of surviving that. So what we were doing, what Dr. Amy Vandergas has done, is taken just this genetic map of a particular species and combine this with, say, distribution abundance of this species in an area. So working with GIS and ArcGIS experts and our IT people, they were able to create these genetic diversity maps of Southern California. This top map shows genetic diversity of a horned, I had said horned toad in an earlier talk. I'm going to get slammed for that. It was a horned lizard in Southern California. And what the light blue and green shows very low genetic diversity. The animals in that area are less likely to survive changes that may stress them. As you move into this area, which is kind of in the LA area, and I think this is the Santa Monica Mountains, you're seeing a stronger genetic diversity of this species. And then when you come down to Camp Pendleton, it's blood red, meaning that this area is highly protected by the U.S. Marine Corps, and lo and behold, the genetic diversity of that species is doing extremely well in that area. So let's hope that the military never gives it up. The similar type of mapping shows for 18 different species across the same landscape. And again, you're seeing a strong genetic diversity here and down into some fairly urban areas here. And a part of that is in relation to the will of the people of Southern California that have voted for taxes that help save chunks of land that they've been informed through a lot of the research done through our research center as being important to those species. So that this becomes important to making decisions about proper conservation of species as we move out into the future. She's also taken the same, and this is Dr. Vandergas, and working with Dr. Eskew, who is an expert on desert tortoise, which is an endangered species, and also desert rare and endangered desert plants. She's taken this same application of being able to look at genetic diversity of species into the Mojave Desert, because in the Mojave Desert there's a great deal of interest in developing solar energy. And so what we've done is gone out into specific habitats, looking at, again, 18 different species from the Mojave ground squirrel to the desert tortoise, and established areas indicated by these circles that would be important to these species. But if you look at the planned renewable energy development indicated by these black dots, this one shows quite a lot of planned activity in this area, which is important genetic diversity for these 18 species. But that's probably the most severe of them. But one thing that you have to do when you create energy is get it from point A to point B. So what transpires is that these green lines are indicating what are the planned transmission lines. And now you're seeing that those are running through a number of these circles. Providing information for these types of activities before they happen gives the developers the ability to route these if possible around these highly critical areas for species. Okay, the last study I'll talk about is work being done by Dr. Robert Fisher, and looking at golden eagles as an iconic species in Southern California, its distribution and habits in terms of, as we develop in Southern California, how do we avoid interfering with such an iconic bird. And this is, again, work that has been requested by developers and also by the municipalities of Southern California to understand how much they can move into an area that's important to, say, a golden eagle. And the golden eagle, as I say, is an iconic species. There are a number of other species associated with it that will survive if we take the caution to try to avoid those areas. So basically, Robert's work is assessing the potential effects of human land use on the occupancy dynamics of golden eagles using 3D spatial modeling. And what does that look like? Real quickly, this just shows what Southern California looks like if you're looking at just the roads indicated by red. It's pretty extensive, particularly on the western part of the area. Similarly, looking at just the development impact models for this area, it's still encouraging to see that there is still a lot of green out there, though, that species can potentially still survive, have good genetic diversity, and good habitat. So just about in this area is where I'll be showing you the habits of the movement of golden eagles. And this just shows the red lines indicate all the places this animal moves in this area. The smaller circles indicate 15-minute stops that this animal makes as it's moving through this area. We can convert this to a model in which we can see all the blue dots are places that this animal visits or moves around to. The bigger dots, though, say the red dots, bigger red dots are where this animal is stopping to feed, to capture prey and feed. And then the yellow dots would be where this animal likes to stop and roost. So what this provides, if you have urbanization going on here, and there's plans for either recreational development or whatever, you want to try to avoid really building up in this area to at least give this animal a chance to coexist with humans in this environment. This just shows another way of looking at this, that again, all these points indicate where an eagle has moved in this area. The gray really indicates fairly heavy urbanization, and as you can see, the yellow indicates the most intensive use of the eagle. And if you will notice that with these gray areas coming out into the red, into the yellow, there's very little movement of eagles into areas where there are structures either to the east or to the north. So this becomes a highly critical area that we can provide this information to municipalities and resource managers to say, if you conserve this area, then people who are living here and decide to take a ride out in the country, there's a good chance you'll see a golden eagle. So that's it. I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of the type of work that we do at the Western Ecological Research Center. I think we are a highly applied science group. We work very closely with land resource managers, both state and federal, to address their issues and problems. And I just feel very, very proud of our 23 principal investigators who are doing this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. And with that said, we'll go ahead and open up to any questions. If you have a question, you can line up at one of the mics. Right behind, there's two on the other side. And we'll take questions.
Outside of California, do you have a similar organization?
Yes, there are 15 other ecologically oriented research centers throughout the country. For example, a center in Oregon, in Corvallis, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, forget Flagstaff, Arizona is the ones out in the west side of the country. Then there are centers in the central part of the country, and then centers in the eastern part of the country, and a center out in Hawaii. So all of us are pretty much engaged in the same kind of work, working on issues that are brought to our attention by resource managers as having a need.
Yeah, if I remember right, the opening slide showed fire, and you didn't happen to mention any work being done by any of the PAIs on wildland fires. So is there any work in that area going on?
A lot. Dr. John Keeley is one of our premier scientists who works quite a lot in Southern California, particularly his expertise is in chaparral. The proper management actions that are necessary for maintaining chaparral habitat. That includes that fire tends to be a necessary factor in the survival of certain of these types of habitats, and that when you suppress fire too much and build up too much fuels, then that can lead to problems. So he works quite a lot on those issues, as well as advising municipalities on issues that you would think would be kind of obvious, that you don't build a house up on a ridge, because when fire takes off, it runs up a ridge. So he does work with municipalities to determine where the best places to place homes or actions that can help protect homes out into the future. And I actually wanted to talk about wildfire, but I just kind of, I had such a hard time trying to figure out what to even talk about. Then we have Matt Brooks and Peter Coates that are working on fire issues out into the Great Basin, because cheatgrass is an invasive species, and now it's causing more intense fires than what has historically happened, so that the sagebrush community out in the Great Basin and in Nevada and in southeastern California is in danger of being converted to a different type of vegetation. Actually, we could lose sagebrush. And what's the Golden West without sagebrush? And then we have Matt Brooks that does work on advising the national park on wildfire issues in Sequoia Kings and Yosemite. So fire is a very important factor. And I kind of wanted to talk about it, but it could also be overwhelming. Okay.
Thank you. In your discussion about the water birds, you did mention that if we let the rice fields go idle, that it would have an impact on the water birds. But wouldn't letting them go idle be the best thing for our drought? Droughts, and also it seems that would be a good thing to do. And since the rice is not native, that those water birds must have been elsewhere before that.
They were where the rice fields or other agricultural or cities occur. This whole valley was covered with, the Central Valley was covered with birds historically, and their habitat has continued to shrink and shrink and shrink. The rice fields are a surrogate for the birds. I'm not sure, as a federal employee, I don't know if I can make the suggestion that we do have to establish better conservation of water ideology in California. There is a lot of water that is wasted in California. So before we penalize the birds by idling rice fields, which causes the birds to have to move into more dense areas of wintering, and when you have that happen, you're not only stressing them with being crowded and reducing their food supply, but there's a greater danger for disease outbreaks. And so we do need to keep them fairly dispersed. And so rice fields, the rice farmers do get quite a lot of subsidies to maintain rice. And I think they would prefer to grow rice. So it's very important to the birds. But I do think that there are conservation efforts that could help.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
In the study on water birds, there were, I believe, 3 different models of climate change that were being used. Can you characterize the range of those models in terms of temperature increase, drought?
Yeah, you're probably pulling me in an area that I would be guessing more than anything. My general knowledge is that the GFDL model is a fairly intense model that indicates a several degree average temperature change. And then the PBML model indicates only a few degree temperature change. And then the current situation is indicating possibly a half a degree temperature change going out to the future.
As we experience rapid warming over the last few years, are those models changing in terms of the probability that is assigned to each of those levels?
The issue is that we probably still haven't had just enough time. This could be an anomaly, and I think that there's going to need to be another 10 or 15 years of assessment before we can really say by 2030 that, this is actually a bona fide change we're seeing. And it's hard to predict. We call them scenarios. We don't call them predictions. And so this is one of the reasons why climate models tend to be so controversial, because we really don't know. We really don't know until we get to that point where we say, this model was said this, and we got to that point, and that actually worked. We do have a very good handle on accuracy of models, though. But in this case, this is new territory that we have not really experienced. Are we experiencing a reoccurring climate issue in time that has been going on for eons? We don't know yet. But I do think we still need another couple of decades before we can feel better about which one of those models is real. Is it the current condition model? Is it the low-level model or the more moderate model?
Thank you.
Okay.
Questions on genetic diversity. The sea otter population in Alaska versus the California coast, are they genetically identical?
No, they aren't genetically identical animals. And for that reason, they have different subspeciation, so that they're same species, genus and species, but they're different subspecies. They likely, though, could interbreed if those populations eventually mix. If you're talking about genetic diversity, there was some indication that the California population had slightly lower genetic diversity than the Alaska population, which would be expected because there was just so much fewer animals. But that has not resulted in, say, a founder's effect or expression of recessive genes that express itself in terms of some type of physical ailment that these animals suffer compared to the Alaska animals. They're pretty much physically, conditionally, they're pretty much the same animals.
Second, on the desert tortoise, my experience in the Mojave is they're very spotty populations. Are they also terribly diverse or appear to be?
Yeah, they're spotty, but it's the work of Christine Berry in particular. Her 40 years of work has shown pretty much that they get around. And so that you think you hear this slowly, but they can move fairly long distances, and so their diversity has not really been an issue in terms of being a factor that would lead to a reduced fitness of those animals.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
How does your organization decide which projects to take on? Do you get requests from municipalities, or do you preemptively study an area where you know change might happen?
We get requests from, say, the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular, or the National Park Service, or Bureau of Land Management, on some particular issue that is of importance to them. For example, a lot of the desert tortoise occur on BLM lands, and they are in the process of leasing lands for renewable energy development. So they will come to us and say, where are these animals occurring? Where can we do the least amount of impact on them? And so, yes, we get approached quite often to engage with our science to help them answer the questions of importance to them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, once again, I want to thank everybody for coming to our November lecture. And if we could please have a round of applause for Mr. Manas.
Thank you.
I like your captions on the waterfowl, but
Oh, yeah, I got it. Hi.
My name is Ann.
Hi, Ann. I'm Keith.
David.
David, hi.